The former incoming president of the University of Maine at Augusta, who withdrew amid complaints from faculty members in 2022, is still collecting about $20,000 a month from the state university system. The Kennebec Journal reports that under the terms of the settlement, Michael Laliberty has collected $372,000 from the University of Maine system as of April 24th without ever working a single day. Laliberty was set to start as UMA president when news surfaced of no confidence votes during his time as president of State University of New York at Delhi. UMS Chancellor Dannel Malloy acknowledged she'd been aware of the no confidence votes, but declined to share that with the search committee.